Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience as we've been working through some technical difficulties. It's my honor to be here with you today moderating this panel on social and environmental justice in the energy transformation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aimee Barnes. I'm a Dartmouth class of 2004, and I joined the board of the Irving Institute at Dartmouth last year. I'm joining you all today from the ancestral homelands of my people, the Kanaka Iwi, or Native Hawaiians, in the Paʻaina of Hawaii, where I run my consulting firm, Huanani Partners, focused on seeding the next generation of climate and energy solutions. I'm looking forward to today's discussion because we get to cover what I consider one of the most important contemporary issues in our field, how we center equity and justice at the core of the climate and clean energy transition. As many of you know, environmental justice has often been left out in climate conversations. And as we have been violently reminded in the past weeks, our country continues to face a crisis of institutional racism, as well as a climate crisis. President Biden has promised to put environmental justice at the forefront of his administrations, and we are already seeing this reflected in his actions and plans. So I look forward to discussing this question of equity and environmental justice today broadly, but also in the context of our current political moment. It is now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists for today's conversation. I'll introduce each of our panelists in turn, and then would love to give each of you a few minutes to make some brief introductory remarks, after which we'll do a round of questions. And then we can open it up for what I hope will be an engaging and lively discussion, bringing in audience Q&A. So please do feel free to share your questions using the Q&A feature on the platform. I'll start by introducing Rose McKinney-James. Rose is the former CEO for the Corporation for Solar Technology and Renewable Resources, commissioner with the Nevada Public Service Commission, and director of the Nevada Department of Business and Industry. She is currently the managing principal of Energy Works LLC and McKinney-James and Associates, and board chair of the Energy Foundation. Her firms provide consulting and advocacy in public affairs, clean energy policy, and sustainable development. And she's certainly someone whose career I have watched and admired from a distance myself. So Rose, thank you for being with us this morning. And I'll turn it to you to provide some brief remarks introducing yourself.
Well, thank you, Aimee. Thank you very much. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here. I am calling in from Carson City, Nevada. This is my adopted state, and here for the state legislature. But I think foremost amongst my activities, I consider myself an advocate. And I've been an advocate for a long time. You've described my bio, so it includes my lived experience as a CEO, as a utility commissioner, and I've also spent some time in the private sector with a focus on government affairs. And my lens has always been tilted toward what I consider an intersection between clean energy and economic development. I've worked for a number of years in community economic development. And I'm pleased to say that many, many years ago, I was able to parlay a law degree into a career focused on advocacy, corporate social responsibility, and governance. And along the way, I've also been gifted with two spectacular sons. So I'm delighted to be here with you and look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rose. Thank you for being with us. And I'll now turn to Gilbert Campbell. Gilbert, thank you for being with us today, also on the road. Gilbert is co-founder and CEO of Volt Energy, a national minority-owned renewable energy firm that finances and develops utility-scale distributed generation and community solar projects, electric vehicle charging stations, and energy storage solutions. He graduated magna cum laude with a BBA in finance from Howard University and received the White House Champions of Change Award from the Obama administration for advancing climate change and equity. So Gilbert, thank you so much for being here today, and please feel free to take a few minutes to introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you, Aimee, and thank you for Dartmouth for having me. And good afternoon to some, and good morning for others. But honored to be here. I feel like an honorary Dartmouth alum. One of my business partners is from Dartmouth. I hear about it all the time. Our outside legal counsel is from Dartmouth, and Dan is a very proud Dartmouth alum. But what the topic at hand today, environmental justice, is vitally important to me personally. We do a lot of work in inner city communities and have seen the impact of environmental racism, how it's played out in COVID-19. Certain communities have been hit the hardest as a result of that. And then I think also broadening, one of my passions is broadening environmental justice to also include, as Rose so eloquently mentioned, economic justice. So, I mean, I think it's a fundamental right for all Americans to breathe clean air, drink clean water, but those communities that have been hit the hardest should also be at the forefront as we're going through this paradigm shift of wealth creation as we move to a clean energy economy, and making sure those communities aren't left behind. And that's a big passion of mine. So look forward to an interesting and lively conversation today.
Great. Well, thank you again for being with us, and glad to have you part of the extended virtual Dartmouth family. Dan, I'll turn to you last, but not least. So Dan Kalafatas serves as the chairman of 3 Degrees, a global B Corp, enabling corporations to answer the call for climate action with renewable energy, clean transportation, and other climate mitigation solutions. He graduated with a BA in economics with honors from Dartmouth and received his MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He sits on the governing council of the Northern Sierra Partnership and also sits with me on the board of the Irving Institute and is one of our fearless leaders for that group and for this event. So Dan, thank you for being with us, and thanks for all you've done for Dartmouth and for making this conference happen. Over to you.
Thank you, Aimee and Rose and Gilbert. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you today. I'll tell you, the best thing I ever did in my life was marry Green, a fellow classmate. But germane to this issue, in the role that we play working with corporations and small businesses alike to help them define and implement their decarbonization strategies, we're increasingly asked to engage with them on how to integrate social and environmental justice outcomes into their decarbonization plan. The idea here is to buy more than a kilowatt hour towards achieving multivariate outcomes simultaneously, or as some have said, to go beyond the megawatt. And I'd love to take a second to just share some real examples, because this is starting to happen today. And it's at the beginning of scaling, which is really the moment that we're in. So Microsoft, a company well known as a tip of the spear clean energy pioneer, last July announced its single largest renewables commitment to date, a 500 megawatt commitment. There's no bones about it. That is a lot of solar. It was a commitment to Soul Systems to develop solar in under-resourced communities throughout the US, prioritizing minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, working with local leaders, and even included a $50 million grant for community development as part of its package. That's a lot of solar. That's a lot of job training that's going into communities that will really benefit from the economic benefits of clean energy. If I can have permission to go on a little more. Last November, we also with Microsoft announced what was a 2-year effort with a Congolese developer named Nuru, which developed a 1.3 megawatt solar plus storage plus street lighting project in Goma in the DRC. Microsoft prepaid for what were deemed peace recs on that project. Chanel, just one more, committed last September, a $35 million commitment to Sunrun to bring solar to multifamily low-income houses across California. 30,000 people will benefit from that. So let me just summarize: 500 megawatts, $50 million in community grants, 30,000 low-income people. In Chanel, a company really early in its sustainability journey, and in Microsoft, a company that's far down the path. This is what corporate procurement can look like when people take the time to not just buy a megawatt hour.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Dan, for all the work you're doing and for sharing those numbers. I think it really brings it home when we're able to break it down in that way. So I want to jump into a few questions, and just a reminder to those who are watching in the audience to please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A, and we'll come around to those in a minute. But Rose, what can utility commissions do to help advance social and environmental justice in the energy transformation?
I think that's a really fascinating question. I think that utility commissioners continue to play a pretty critical role in the infrastructure of energy policy. I think
they, at all levels of government, a focus on this question of social and environmental justice, as well as across a wide variety of organizations. And just a quick follow-up question for you, Rose. Would love to hear, obviously, in your role as the board president for Energy Foundation, what role is the Energy Foundation and Clear Result? What are they playing in this?
Well, as it relates to the Energy Foundation, I'm obviously very excited to chair the board. For many, that was an interesting point of advancement for an organization that has been around for a while. But more importantly, I have the opportunity to champion the role of philanthropy and to underscore its contribution, because I think we have the opportunity to make climate and clean energy an important space by identifying and funding grantees on the ground with local and community relationships. I think we have the ability to craft policies that are meaningful and informed by those who are actually impacted. So we have a suite of grantees across the country. We have recently shifted our focus to really invest in DEI as a value proposition for the foundation. Building capacity. I think that is something that is really important, and building capacity that is focused on self-direction is increasingly important when we talk about social impacts and social justice. I'd like to think that the strength of philanthropy and maybe of the Energy Foundation is working with our partner funders in a very strategic way to think through the importance of embracing inclusion as a part of every decision. And the overarching goal of tackling climate and clean energy policy is now at the forefront of every decision that we make. And it's a top-down process. This is embedding it into the way that we conduct our business. You mentioned Clear Result. That is a new opportunity for me. I joined that board in Q4 of last year. And I joined a board in a company that has been dedicated and placing a premium on identifying solutions that are required to reduce energy consumption. So I actually found myself in a space where Dan has demonstrated a ton of leadership over a number of years. Let me just say that I was recently asked to join an event that was sponsored and hosted by their Black employee affinity group. And we had, I think, a pretty candid conversation about the importance of business, including in their operations, the need to focus on these issues. This is something that I feel strongly about from a personal standpoint. As I said, my lived experience is what you see. And over all of the many years that I've been involved in clean energy, I haven't always seen people who look like me, who have come from the experience that I've had, particularly in the workforce. And I've tried to make that a point of relevance for my colleagues who are in business. And that's why I have such great respect for the work that Gilbert and his team do, because he is the face for an activity that is so important to advancing climate, but as a business, being a leader and helping to create this focus becomes, I think, really important. So, as I said, clear result is new to me. Let's just say that many businesses are now facing the pressure. They are facing the reckoning, and they are forced to find a path toward embracing and including inclusiveness as a means of dealing with their human capital. These are the folks who drive the results, no pun intended. And so it's been, I think, a great opportunity to be affiliated with an organization that's attempting to make that a part of their fabric.
Absolutely. Well, and thank you for all you're doing with both of those organizations. I know for myself, I also advise some philanthropic consultant organizations, and it's been really, I think, impressive to see what philanthropy overall, but the Energy Foundation in particular, has done to drive change on this issue. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that labor in the power that's really been built in the equity and environmental justice community. And just you look at how that's in turn affected where we are from a policy perspective in this country, with the Biden administration really placing equity at the core of its climate work. So kudos to you for all of that. I think it's really exciting. And I think it provides a nice transition, Gilbert, to you. I think Rose shared some really concrete examples of how she's made the, prioritize social and environmental justice in her work in different roles. I would love to hear more about the efforts of SEIA and Renewables Forward to advance equity, social and environmental justice, and a little more about your role in those efforts. So over to you.
Sure. So I've been afforded the wonderful opportunity to sit on the executive committee of the board of SEIA, led by another Dartmouth alum, Aimee Hopper, who I believe spoke on a session earlier. But where it really started my involvement on the board of SEIA is I believe in be the change you want to see in the world. And I reached out to Aimee, probably maybe like 2 years ago, and just said, I had some concerns about the industry as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion before this became a hot button issue. And she said, listened and talked, and I could tell she was a true advocate and champion. And I decided to run for the board, and I was elected to the board of SEIA. And it really, I think, have tried to lend a unique perspective as an African-American solar developer, and some of the challenges, some of the wonderful opportunities that we've been blessed and afforded with. So with that said, SEIA has created the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Environmental Justice Task Force at the board level. And Aimee, under her leadership, has made this the highest priority item for us over like the last 18 months. So we've really been focused on things, for example, of creating a supplier diversity database. In many cases, some of the largest corporations in the world will reach out and say, okay, well, where do we find, diverse companies, whether it's, installer, developer, legal, et cetera, across the solar supply chain. So we really have done an outreach effort with organizations like BOSS, finding and identifying diverse solar suppliers. At SEIA board, we also are creating, kind of leveraging like the LEED certification model. What does best practices look like for diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental justice? And developing a scorecard for companies to give real commitments and to be measured against that, to say we are serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environmental justice. Also, on the SEIA board, we have a policy group that is thinking, always working and advocating on the Hill and at state and local levels, as far as what are the things that can be done to make our industry, the solar industry, more inclusive, and make sure it looks more like America as far as workforce and the entrepreneurs that are part of it. You also mentioned Renewables Forward, which is another organization that I'm honored to be a part of, along with Dan and 3 Degrees, which is basically a collective of CEOs in the clean energy space. It's solar developers, it's consultants like 3 Degrees, it's financial partners like Leyline and a group of others that just said, look, we want to get something done. It's time for action, but let's have a coordinated effort across multiple different companies. So a couple specific things that we're doing is creating a mentorship program for diverse firms to help them scale and leveraging the huge collective that we have to really tackle some of the biggest problems for diverse firms to be able to grow their companies. One is access to capital, being that we have capital partners, or all of us in the group can get someone, whether it's tax equity, sponsor equity, permanent financing debt to someone. Access to opportunities. Dan so luckily mentioned some of the unique things that companies like Microsoft and Chanel are doing, but you need advocates to give you those introductions to those companies. Some of the other things at Renewable Forward that we're looking at doing is pooling our resources together to fund things like scholarships for students of color that are looking to get into clean energy, and sharing best practices for hiring. Rose mentioned that earlier. That is critically important. As you know, there's a ton of jobs that are being created, but it's not just the entry-level jobs, which is very important. And there's an effort to recruit from HBCUs and majority institutions targeting students of color, but also in the C-suite. What does your board look like? And making sure that there's a good, there's not just a good faith effort. You have to have those relationships. And I'm also part of another organization that Rose has been a giant in, the American Associations of Blacks in Energy. A new board member there, and Abe has really been a leader and a model as far as what should diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices look like. So again, I'm excited to be part of some wonderful organizations, and I serve on the advisory board of 3 Degrees under Dan's leadership and the rest of the 3 Degrees team. They're always in our board conversations. What can we do to push the envelope as far as innovative projects? How do we incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion into the products and services that 3 Degrees offers? So I'm just very fortunate to play a small part in wonderful organizations that are fully committed to addressing this issue.
Well, that is a great transition, Dan, to a question for you. Would love to hear more. Gilbert teed it up nicely, but would love to hear a little more about how 3 Degrees is just cultivating that integration of equity and a just transition into your work with corporations that are seeking to decarbonize.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. Delighted to be playing a small part in a really broad effort by a lot of people over many decades. And from that perspective, I'm going to build on a point that Rose brought up, which is the pressure on corporations today. And I think that's broadly understood. I think in the energy sector, people are just starting to connect the dots about how hungry corporations are to have progress and stories on ESG and DEI, at the C-suite level, at the board level. And the energy industry, clean energy industry, has a product to sell that can provide amplification benefits beyond the traditional benefits that energy delivers to them. So a power purchase agreement off a utility scale wind farm has one set of benefits around it. Take that same wind farm and put it on tribal lands owned by a tribe, has a totally different set of attributes for it. There's an entirely new value layer that the energy industry, I don't think, is concentrating enough on creating the defining and helping educate corporations that these options exist and putting them in a position to actually value that value layer. And I believe this is a tremendous opportunity for energy suppliers to have a richer relationship, a stickier relationship, a non-commoditized relationship. And I think the signals are coming more and more powerfully over time. You have energy managers within these companies that have gone from focusing on buying low-cost, reliable energy to low-cost, reliable, renewable energy, serving decarbonization goals. And now a smaller but quickly growing group of energy managers focused on buying low-cost, reliable, renewable energy that provides diversity, equity, inclusivity, co-benefits. And I'd really like to call out the leadership of Miranda Valentine, CEO of REBA, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and the whole team there that's advanced a really simple and elegant idea to corporate buyers, which is just put it in the RFP. Express a preference for projects that deliver environmental justice benefits in procurement processes on the idea that you never know what you'll get back. And beyond that, you can actually explicitly integrate the criteria into scoring systems, and Reba, and with a nod to Salesforce, has content on that. Just to share one example, in March, Massachusetts announced its third round solicitation for up to 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, putting an emphasis on these issues, requiring developers to spell out how they'll hire and train a diverse workforce, requiring tracking and monitoring against plan, building a supply chain that prioritizes underserved communities. This is all just good management and good leadership, an example of the stakeholder processes that both Rose and Gilbert have spoken to.
Great, thanks, Dan. And I am really excited because we have a number of great questions coming in from the audience. So keep them coming, please. But I'm going to start bringing those into the conversation and want to just pick up on a thread, Dan. I think, specific examples like that sometimes can be really helpful, put it in the procurement. And Gilbert, there was a question here for you that was about best practices for DEI and what are some of the nuts and bolts of that. And I think sometimes it is really helpful for folks just to get clear examples of what that means. So wondering if you or anybody else in the panel would be willing to just take a couple minutes to talk about that.
Sure. And Amanda, that was a great question that you posed in the chat. And I'll take a stab, and hopefully Dan and Rose can chime in on, with their expertise as well. I think part of it is DEI has to be woven in the fabric of the DNA of your company. And I think it starts with leadership at the board level, the C-suite. People need to see themselves in leadership teams, especially people of color and women, to see that you have an opportunity to see yourself in that position. I think the products and services that you offer and the communities that you serve speaks volume to how you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where do you spend your money when you talk about procurement, supplier diversity? Are you working with diverse suppliers, women-owned businesses for goods and services that you need to buy to run your business? I think is also vitally important. So, and then where do you spend your philanthropic dollars? So there's so many different things across the fabric of a company that if you make that part of your DNA, you will always be looking through that lens of what can we do better? How can we improve on what we're doing? But it takes leadership at the highest levels that brings diverse perspectives, diverse experiences, and a diverse set of ideas to drive that throughout certain companies. When you look at a lot of companies, unfortunately, it doesn't look like America. You look at the board or you look at the C-suite. So until that is changed, it really is hard to kind of drive progress downstream. So hopefully that addressed some of your questions, Amanda, to that point.
Thank you, Gilbert. Yes, I think having a C-suite that looks like our country is definitely important. And from a gender perspective, I know there's something that some of my colleagues call the scrolling problem, where if you look at the organization as a whole, there's diversity, but the top tends to be predominantly white and male. And then as you scroll down to, more junior staff and executive assistants, that's where you start to see women and, Black, Indigenous people of color represented. So I think making sure that we have that sort of diversity through the whole scroll and not just, towards the bottom is important. But Rose, I wanted to turn to you. There was a question kind of in this thread as well in terms of just more specificity, if you don't mind diving into how PUCs can help on this issue, given your wisdom and experience in that arena.
Well, it's been some time since I was a commissioner, but I think PUCs, again, have a unique position in the hierarchy of how decisions are made. And as an individual commissioner, there are certain things that you can do, but collectively, as a commission, rallying around certain themes, I think, becomes important. I think commissions are required to educate themselves on these issues. Their role is to provide guidance and to regulate, if you will, investor-owned utilities and the things that come under that. But I think specifically, depending on their statutory authority, they have the ability to think about things like procurement. I think about things with little I don't know what you want to call them, but so let's talk about the 4 Ps. So understanding the purpose, okay? As a utility commission, that oversight means that you are driving for your jurisdiction, for your state, outcomes. You have to consider the economics. You have to consider a range of stakeholders, from the utilities themselves to those who do business with them. So purpose, procurement. I would love to see utility commissioners lean in a little more to decisions around procurement to make sure that they are more inclusive. The people, commissions themselves need to think about who they employ, how they make decisions to show up. And so that is one way I think the commissions can be engaged. You know, there are limitations. We know that it's a quasi-judicial environment, but outside of that, commissioners who are willing to lean in and make this a part of their leadership becomes, I think, an important component. So those are, you know, my P's: my purpose, my procurement, my people. That's the way I'd focus on it.
I love those P's. That's also, I will add another P, very practical way to think about it. So thank you for framing that out. There's so many great questions here. So I'm gonna tee one up for Dan, and then I'm gonna try and pull some of the threads together for a mega question that we can all try to hit a rapid response for a final round. But so Dan, there's a question here about, you know, essentially, how realistic is all of this? So the question is, you know, this sounds good in the United States in terms of alternative or renewable energy, but realistically, particularly in developing countries and in emerging markets, is this practical? Are we denying essentially social and environmental justice to those in other countries who can't afford to do it by focusing on just renewables? And so curious for you, as somebody who's obviously worked both in the US, but also in, you know, other parts of the world through your business, is that something that you're seeing on the ground? Is it sort of this, you know, sacrifice or trade-off that you are having to make?
Well, as came up yesterday on the Sustainable Energy for All panel, just simply deploying energy in all forms towards the creation of affluence and quality of living improvements on its own can create massive outcomes. The thing that's coming to mind for me right now is Sequest Capital just recently announced a partnership with Shell and Macquarie Group to deploy cook stoves to 10 million people in Africa. This isn't a comprehensive solution by any means, but that's a lot of people. And that's leveraging a carbon offset market and carbon revenues to get that job done. And as was alluded to yesterday, pardon me, by Nicole and Rose and Richard and others, there's just so many benefits to delivering energy solutions at the household and the village level throughout the world. So that's the beginning of an answer. And we're just beginning our journey on this front in the developing world.
Absolutely. Well, and I know from similar work in this space that we're seeing the costs of renewables at parity with or below the costs of traditional fossil fuels, not just in the US, but globally increasingly. So I think that's right. And also the idea that it's a more expensive alternative is just increasingly not really the case, which is a great position to be in for those of us in this industry. But I'm going to just turn now to kind of summarizing some of the other threads in some of these other questions. There's a question here about whether and how we can reach disadvantaged communities, low and moderate income populations if we don't solve the broadband gap. And I think this is a question that speaks to the question of infrastructure, which is certainly a hot one in our country right now, and the infrastructure that we need to provide to ensure that we're able to deploy renewable energy and climate and clean tech solutions, particularly to everyone, but the most disadvantaged. I think there's also some questions here about how do we go beyond, obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, but how do we go beyond and really ensure that we're seeing systemic change? There's a question here about how robust this current trend is. Is this a boom time or a sort of a phenomenon? And will we see efforts sort of wane in a future recession or downturn? So I think there's another question about, how systemic is the change? How can we make change more systemic? Is this something that's here to stay? And then finally, I think there's another question here about whether the challenges that we face in the energy sector in terms of incorporating social and environmental equity, are these fundamentally different, or are these the same kinds of challenges that are being faced in different industries across the country and around the world? So multiple threads there. Don't feel the need to pick up on all of them, but in your last sort of 30 seconds closing remarks, pick whatever thread of that you'd like to pull on briefly.
Well, if I were to guess whether or not this effort or this movement is going to be durable, I would weigh in, and of course I am from Nevada, so I will bet that this is sustainable. I think it's sustainable because of who we hear carrying the voice. I'm of a certain generation. Movements are advanced based on the commitment that you see from the people who potentially benefit from those outcomes. And I think it's critically important to support those who are raising their voices with viable and practical solutions. So I do think there's a built-in durability here, because in order for us to achieve the goals that we've all committed ourselves to around climate and clean energy, this is a must. This is a requirement. When you talk about the need to make systemic changes, for most of my life, we've been talking about equity, but not in the way we're talking about it now. And so I think if we can maintain that pressure, if we can maintain that momentum, and we appreciate the value of what happens on the other side, the opportunity that's embedded in equity, I think we will see a greater emphasis on this moving forward. So I'll leave it there for my fellow panelists to offer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rose, and thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Gilbert, I'll go to you next, and then Dan, you can have the final word.
Sure. I agree with everything Rose just said. I mean, systemic change is not going to happen overnight. I mean, but what will it take? It's a combination of both public and private partnerships. And let's look at, like, from a federal standpoint, the current administration is doing things a lot different, putting things into law. So, for example, having the Environmental and Climate Justice Division at DOJ is vitally important. Making environmental justice woven into all aspects of the federal government at DOE, at Department of Transportation, across the board makes difference. State and local municipalities have a powerful tool when it comes to, for example, land use planning and zoning, where certain projects are. Corporations, Dan has mentioned several times, have a part that they can play to make sure that they are contributing to growing diverse businesses in inner cities and other rural areas as well too. So it's just, and consumers, we all have the power of our spending power to hold corporations accountable, hold public officials accountable. If they're not doing what they're supposed to do, vote them out. But we also have to make sure, not to get in the political rant, that we make it so that everyone can vote. But that'll be my closing remark.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thank you for being with us. Go ahead, Dan.
Pardon me, I'll just deepen that point that I think this category is a superb spot for federal, state, and local policy incentives to really cultivate distributed resources. Distributed resources drive environmental justice, energy efficiency, community solar, net metering, low price point electric vehicles, municipalization, offer bite-sized opportunities for underrepresented populations to develop, own, benefit from this energy transition far more than centralized energy systems. And so I might close with a thought from the founding father of Taoism, Lao Tzu, who said, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And so my charge is at a personal level, begin the journey, get your organizations to do the same thing. And if you've already started it, let's find some ideas to scale.
Well, those are great words of wisdom to close on. Dan, thank you. And again, Gilbert and Rose, thank you for being with us today and sharing part of your day and also your wisdom. Thanks to the audience, especially for letting us go over by a few minutes, but I did, since we started a little late, wanted to make sure that we had time for this incredible discussion, given that we had this great panel here. The next session starts at 2:15 Eastern, Driving Progress on Energy and Climate Policy, an incredible panel there. So please do check it out. If you want to further discuss this topic, please do visit the lounge area where you'll be able to gather with other conference attendees for more informal discussion of this panel and other topics at one of the lounge tables. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our incredible panelists. It's been such a pleasure being here with you.
Aimee, thank you for excellent job moderating.
Thank you. Absolutely.